It wasn't mine. 3 words, spoken by a man with empty pockets, cracked boots, and hollow eyes standing alone in a room full of hell's angels. The wallet on the table held enough cash to feed him for a month. He gave it back anyway. Cole Maddox didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at a homeless man who had just done something most people with full bank accounts wouldn't do. Believe one honest decision can change a life. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. The name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Ethan Walker found the wallet, he had exactly $4.37 in the world. He knew the exact amount because he had been counting it every morning. For the past 9 days, the way a dying man counts his breaths. It's 37 cents, a crumpled single. 3 ones that had been washed so many times they felt like a cloth. And a handful of coins he carried in his left jacket pocket because the right one had a hole in it. He knew if he lost those coins, he would have nothing. And nothing, he had learned over the past 22 months on the streets of Phoenix, was a different kind of pain than anything a person could prepare for. The Lord stood and went still. He had not eaten since the previous afternoon when a woman outside the Safeway on Indian School Road handed him half a turkey sandwich without making eye contact. He had eaten it slowly, standing behind the store near the dumpsters where no one could see him, trying to make it last. It didn't last long. Nothing did. Phoenix in January could be cold enough to cut through you, especially before the sun came up. Ethan had learned that his first winter on the streets, when he still believed he would be inside by the time real cold hit, was wrong. Now he knew how to layer thin cotton under a flannel under a Carhartt jacket he had found in a donation bin and outside a church on McDowell Avenue. He kept the collar turned up. He kept moving. Because moving was the only way to stay warm when you had nowhere to go. He was cutting through the parking lot of Manny's Roadside Diner on the north side of Phoenix when he saw the motorcycles. Not 1 or 2, not a handful. Dozens of them, lined up with the kind of precision that told him immediately these were not casual riders, were massive and polished even in the gray early light, and they filled the far end of the parking lot in long diagonal rows. Most of them. He recognized the sound of them, even when they were still something about the weight and the chrome, and the way they sat low on their kickstands told a person everything about who they belonged to. Ethan kept his head down and walked faster. He had learned quickly on the streets that the safest thing he could do when he encountered any kind of organized group was to make himself invisible. It wasn't about fear exactly. It was about math. People in groups tended to notice homeless men the way they noticed stray dogs with either pity or irritation. And he had been on the receiving end of both enough times to prefer invisibility. He was almost past the row of bikes when his boot caught something. Down. A wallet. Black leather, thick with use, lying beside the rear tire of the last motorcycle in the row. It must have fallen from a jacket pocket or slipped off a seat. He stood there for a moment, just looking at it. His body didn't move, but his mind moved very fast. He picked it up. He told himself it was just to move it out of the way, so no one would run it over. But when he held it, he felt the weight of it, and that weight meant something. He glanced around the parking lot. Nobody was watching. The diner's windows were fogged from the warmth inside. The parking lot was empty except for him, the motorcycles. Opened the wallet. Later, when people asked him what he felt in that moment, he would struggle to describe it accurately. The closest he ever got was this. It felt like standing at the edge of something that could either save him or end him, and the difference between the two came down to a single choice. Inside the wallet, there was cash. Real cash, not a few crumpled bills, but a thick fold of 20s and 50s held together with a rubber band. He didn't count it. He didn't need to. He could see enough to understand that what he was holding was more money than he had seen. In one place in nearly 2 years. His brain, the part of his brain that had been calculating survival for 22 months, began running numbers automatically. Food, work clothes, transportation, a week of stability. 2. Maybe enough to get back on his feet if he was careful. His hands were shaking. He didn't realize that until he turned the wallet over. and found the photograph tucked behind a clear plastic window. It was a family photograph. Not a studio portrait, not the kind of posed thing people kept as formalities. The candid shot, the kind that gets printed and carried because it catches something real. Big-shouldered and leather-jacketed, was laughing at something off camera. Beside him stood a woman with dark curly hair and a smile that looked like it came easy to her. Between them, one on each side, were two kids. A boy who looked about 7 wearing a baseball cap. Couldn't have been more than 4. A girl who couldn't have been holding what appeared to be a stuffed rabbit with one ear. Ethan looked at that photograph for a long time. He thought about his own father. He thought about what his father used to say when Ethan was young. Back in the house in Flagstaff where they had a yard with a rusted swing set and a dog named Copper who chased anything that moved. When his father was not a complicated man. He was a man who worked with his hands and believed in a very short list of rules. And the one he repeated most often, the one Ethan heard so many times as a child that it had become the interior wallpaper of his conscience, was simple and absolute. You don't take what belongs to someone else, especially not when they can't see you doing it. And closed the wallet. He stood there in the cold parking lot for a moment longer, and he felt something shift inside him. Not peace, exactly. More like clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when you stop calculating and just know. He walked toward the diner. The bell above the door made a flat metallic sound when he pushed it open. Warmth hit him immediately, along with the smell of coffee and bacon grease and something sweet maple syrup. Maybe for a half second, the hunger in his stomach became physical pain through it. He breathed. He saw them the moment he stepped inside. Dinner was not large, and nearly every table and booth was occupied by men in leather cuts. Those angels. The patches were visible from the door. In white. Death head insignia. Names and chapters stitched in arcing letters. Women, too, scattered among the men, but the room had a weight and a density to it that told Ethan this was not casual company. People who had built something together, and they sat inside it like a wall. Maybe, possibly more. Every head in the room turned toward the door when Ethan entered. Went quiet, not gradually, all at once, like someone turned a switch. Ethan had experienced many kinds of silence in his life. The silence after a car accident. The silence in an empty apartment after the person you loved left. Silence of a shelter at 3 a.m. when men slept in rows and you lay awake wondering how you got there. But this silence was different. It had a texture to it, pressed against him from all sides. He kept walking. He found the largest table, the one at the center of the room, where the men sat with the posture of people who expected others to come to them rather than the other way around. The man at the head of the table was broad across the shoulders, maybe 50 or close to it, with gray at his temples and a jaw that looked like it had absorbed damage and kept going, were dark and completely still. The way eyes look on people who have spent a long time watching for things before they happen. Ethan placed the wallet on the table in front of him. He said it wasn't mine. Nobody moved. The man at the head of the table looked at the wallet. Then he looked at Ethan. He didn't look at him the way most people looked at Ethan, which was sideways, gone with him, or through, with that particular combination of discomfort and guilt that people wore when they saw someone who reminded them of how quickly circumstances could change. This man looked at him directly, level and full, the way you look at someone you intend to take seriously. Did you find it? He said. Outside, Ethan said. The last bike in the far row. The man reached out and opened the wallet. He looked inside for maybe 3 seconds. Then he looked back up at Ethan. You counted it? No. Why not? Ethan thought about how to answer that. Feel a person in the room watching him. He could feel the weight of it. He could feel his empty stomach and his shaking hands and the cold still living in his bones from the parking lot. Because it wasn't mine to count, he said. Something moved across the man's face, brief and controlled, the way a flash of emotion moves across someone who has spent years training himself not to show them. And saw it. The man said, sit down. Ethan sat down. The man's name was Cole Maddox. He said it without ceremony, the way a person says something that is simply a fact. president of the Phoenix chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. And the wallet was his. Half was of his wife, Diane, and his kids, Marcus and Lily, taken 3 summers ago at a 4th of July barbecue in his brother's backyard. Cole waved at the woman behind the counter without turning his head, and she came over and poured coffee into a mug. She set in front of Ethan without being asked. Cole slid the menu across the table. "Order whatever you want," Cole said. "You're not in a hurry." Ethan looked at the menu. His hands were still not entirely steady. Picked the cheapest breakfast plate on the menu out of habit before Cole reached over and turned the menu back around. "You want?" Cole said again. "I mean that." Ordered eggs, bacon, toast, browns, and orange juice. Arrived. He ate slowly because he was trying not to look desperate. He mostly failed. Cole watched him without judgment. "You got a name?" Cole asked. "Ethan Walker." "What are you doing out here, Ethan Walker?" Who had been asked variations of that question by social workers and shelter volunteers and police officers and well-meaning strangers for 22 months, found himself telling the truth. Not the short version, not the edited version, not the version designed to get the minimum amount of sympathy without inviting pity. The old version. He had been a diesel mechanic in Flagstaff, trained, 8 years of experience working on commercial vehicles, in long-haul trucks, equipment. He'd been good at it. More than good. He had a reputation in his industry for being able to diagnose problems that stumped other mechanics. The kind of skill that took years to develop and couldn't be faked. He owned a truck, rented a house, had plans. Then the economy tilted, and his employer downsized, and Ethan found himself laid off at 36 with a set of skills that were industry-specific and a job market in Flagstaff that had no openings for what he knew. He moved to Phoenix, believing the larger city would have more options, and also more competition. And while he looked for work, his savings eroded, and the money he had set aside moved faster than he expected. And then, one day he was behind on rent, and the next day he was very behind, and the day after. The door to his apartment had a notice on it. When he lost his truck, when he couldn't make the payments. Without the truck, he couldn't get to the job sites that were hiring. The job, he couldn't make the payments on anything else. It was not one catastrophic moment. It was a series of small ones that accumulated until the weight became something he couldn't carry anymore. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer solutions or corrections or sympathy nods. He listened with the full attention. The full attention of a man who understood that what Ethan was telling him deserved to be heard completely. When Ethan finished, Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have your certification still?" "You know I do," Ethan said. "Somewhere. They might have been in the storage unit I lost access to, but I remember the certificate numbers. You can get copies. You want to work, or you want someone to hand you something?" The question was direct. It wasn't cruel. It was the kind of question a man asks when he's deciding whether to take something seriously. "I want to work," Ethan said. "I've always wanted to work. I just need someone to look at me long enough to see that." Cole nodded slowly. He reached into the chest pocket of his leather cut and pulled out a card. He held it for a moment, looking at it, before he set it face up on the table and pushed it toward Ethan. "Your personal number is on the back," Cole said. "Not the club number. Mine." Ethan picked up the card. "Call me when you truly need help," Cole said. "I mean that too." Ethan folded the card carefully and put it in his breast pocket, the one without the hole. The rest of his breakfast. Ethan. When he finished, he stood up, thanked Cole without making a production of it, and walked out of the diner. Behind him, the room stayed quiet for a moment longer than normal. It started up again. He didn't look back. Outside in the parking lot, with the cold returning to his bones and the warmth of the meal already beginning to fade, Ethan felt something he had not felt in longer than he could accurately remember. Small and fragile, and he didn't trust it entirely. It was there. Something like hope. He told himself not to lean on it. It had failed him before. But he kept Cole's card in his breast pocket all the same. And when he walked away from Manny's roadside diner that morning, he walked slightly differently than he had walked in. Not with swagger, not with relief, but with the posture of a man who had just been treated like a person and who was trying to remember what that felt like. He did not call Cole Maddox that day. He would not call him the next day either, or the day after that. What happened in the weeks that followed was not a swift improvement. It was not a movie moment, where kindness is immediately rewarded with transformation. Ethan, alone, trying every resource and every contact and every door he could find. He went to the employment center on Van Buren and filled out applications. He listed his certifications and his experience and his 8 years in the field. He asked the woman at the desk, a tired woman named Patricia, who wore a lanyard with a smiley face on it, whether she knew of any diesel shops in the metro area that were taking on experienced mechanics. Patricia ran the search and printed a list and handed it to him with a thin smile that told him she had printed this list many times for many people. He took the list and went to every address on it over the following week. The address, something went wrong, not dramatically, in ways that were easy to name. It was more subtle than that. Walk in, introduce himself, ask to speak to a shop manager or owner. They would look at him, taking in his clothes and his backpack, and the particular way that 2 years on the streets had changed a person's surface, and something would shift in their expression. Be polite. Most of them, they would tell him to leave a resume or fill out an application on the website or come back on Tuesday when the hiring manager would be in. He came back on Tuesday. The hiring manager was never in. He left resumes. Nobody called. He filled out applications. One, the portal would acknowledge receipt and then go silent. He knew some of this was the normal difficulty of job searching without an address and without reliable phone access. Words understood. He understood that. He had been navigating that particular obstacle since the beginning. What he did not understand was when the rejections started coming faster than the applications. This time it happened was at a mid-sized commercial shop near the airport. He had gone in, he went, spoken briefly with the front desk, he left his name and a description of his experience, he went east, and been asked to return the following day for an informal conversation with the owner. He went back the next day. The woman at the front desk looked at him differently the second time. The expression was careful, in a way it hadn't been before. She said, "We've decided to go in a different direction." He asked if he could speak to the owner directly. "He's unavailable," she said. Ethan looked at her for a moment. He could hear voices in the back of the shop. He could hear the specific sound of men working on engines, the sound he had grown up with, the sound that felt more like home to him than anything else. He said and left. 2 days later, at a different shop on the west side, the owner himself came out to speak with him. It was a man in his late 50s named Roy, thick and direct, who shook Ethan's hand with a firm grip and asked him to describe his diagnostic experience in detail. Ethan did. Roy nodded along, asking specific questions, the kind of questions that told Ethan this was a man who knew what he was talking about and was genuinely evaluating whether Ethan did too. At the end of the conversation, he said, "Ethan, you know what? Be straight with you. Exactly what I need on paper. But I got a call this morning about you." Ethan stopped breathing. "What kind of call?" he asked. Roy's expression was uncomfortable. "Someone told me you were let go from your last job for theft. You took money from a client's vehicle while it was on the lift." The words landed in Ethan's chest like something physical. "It's not true," he said. "I figured I'd hear your side," Roy said. He wasn't aggressive about it. He wasn't cruel. He was a practical man, dealing with information he didn't know what to do with. "It's not true," Ethan said again. "I've never stolen from a client in my life. Stolen from anyone." Roy looked at him for a long time. And he said, "Who would say something like that about you?" Ethan didn't have an answer, but as he walked away from Roy's shop that afternoon, he began to think very carefully about the pattern of the past few weeks. The drawn offers, the avoided callbacks, the changed expressions, and the way doors that should have opened kept closing slightly before he could reach them. Was making calls ahead of him. The realization was cold and specific, Not like fear, but like being handed a piece of information you have no immediate way to use. He needed to figure out who. He needed to figure out why. One. And he needed to do it without the resources, the phone, the computer, access, or the network that most people took for granted when they tried to solve a problem. And he sat on a bench near the library on Central Avenue and thought about it for a long time. When he stood up and started walking again, the card in his breast pocket seemed heavier than it had before. He didn't call. Not yet. He still believed he could fix this himself. He went back to the employment center. He told Patricia what Roy had told him, leaving out the emotion and sticking to the facts. Patricia listened with an expression that had seen too much to be shocked. You need to know who the caller is, she said. I know, Ethan said. It's not easy without resources. I know that too. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said quietly, the kind of quiet that meant she was going slightly outside her job description. One is actively calling your potential employers before you get there to be getting your information somehow. The applications you're leaving, the names you're giving, one has access to those. Ethan sat with that for a moment. The apps are online, he said slowly, and accessible to anyone with the right login, Patricia said, the right contact. The employment center logged all applications through a central system. It was meant to streamline the process to allow employers to cross-reference candidates, a tool designed for efficiency. It was also, Ethan now understood, a way for someone to track exactly which employers he was approaching and when. He thanked Patricia and walked out into the afternoon. He bounced back. His backpack disappeared 2 days later. He left it for less than an hour at the community center while he used their computer to search for more contacts. When he came back, it was gone. Inside had been his change of clothes, his toiletry kit, and most critically, the folder he kept his documents in. Copies of his training certificates, his employment history printouts, the notes he had accumulated over months of looking. Not just gone in a way that felt intentional. At night, lying on a donated sleeping mat in the overflow section of the downtown men's shelter, Ethan stared at the water-stained ceiling and tried to construct the shape of what was happening to him. Someone knew he was looking for work. Someone was moving ahead of him. Someone had access to his documentation or had identified the places he kept it and had arranged for it to disappear. And now, with his certifications physically gone, even employers who were willing to take a chance on him would have less to work with. He thought about Roy. He thought about Patricia. He thought about Cole Maddox, the card in his breast pocket. He thought about the card in his breast pocket, which he had not washed the jacket since finding because he afraid the card would dissolve. And then at the end of that long chain of thinking, dark one, something clicked into place that was worse than anything else. And still, the story being spread about him that he had stolen money from the Hells Angels, that he had taken what he wanted from the wallet before returning the empty thing. That story was not just a rumor. Specific. It was targeted. It named a specific group and a specific act in a way that was calculated to do maximum damage with minimum traceable origin. If that story reached Cole Maddox before Ethan did, Cole had offered the openness, respect. The possibility of connection would be poisoned. And if Cole believed it, Ethan would not just be back where he started. He'd have nowhere left to go. The shelter lights went out at 10. Around him, men shifted and coughed and dreamed bad dreams out loud. Ethan lay still and thought about what his father used to say about being honest. He thought about how honesty was supposed to protect you. He thought about how sometimes it made you a target instead. The card in his pocket, the number on the back, one call, and he closed his eyes. In the morning, he would figure out one more thing he could try on his own. But the card wasn't going anywhere, and neither, he realized with a slow and building certainty, was whoever was trying to destroy him. He did not call Cole Maddox that morning. He told himself he would try one more thing first. It was what he had been telling himself for 11 days straight. And every morning, the list of things to try got shorter and the weight in his chest got heavier. The card stayed in his pocket and his pride stayed intact. And he kept moving, because moving was the only thing left that felt like agency. He went back to the library on Central Avenue, the one that let him use the computer for 45 minutes at a stretch if he signed up on the sheet by the door before 8 in the morning. There, at 7:50, he sat down at Terminal 4, which was the one in the corner that faced the wall. On it, and he opened a browser and started searching for his own name. He had not done this before. It felt strange and slightly shameful, like reading someone else's mail. Patricia's words had stayed with him, turning over in his mind throughout the night. One has access to those. Someone is moving ahead of you. Its results came back in under a second. Most of them were nothing. Name, different Ethan Walkers, in different cities doing different things. Dentist in Ohio, a college baseball player in Tennessee, real estate agent in Oregon. He scrolled through 3 pages of results and found nothing that was obviously about him. Then he refined the search. He added Phoenix. He added mechanic. What came back stopped him cold. It was a forum post on a community message board used by local small business owners in the Phoenix metro area. It was called a Z-Biz Talk, and it had been running for years as a place for independent business owners to share advice, referrals, warnings. It's the kind of forum that showed up in Google results precisely because it had high engagement and a long history. The post was 3 weeks old. The subject line read, "Warning, job seeker with theft history targeting mechanic shops." Ethan read it twice. The post did not use his full name, but it described him accurately enough that anyone who had met him would recognize him immediately. Late 20s, you think, homeless, aiming to be a certified diesel mechanic with Flagstaff experience, working the Phoenix job market. The post said he had a documented history of stealing from employers and clients, that his certifications were falsified, and that he had most recently been connected to an incident involving the Hells Angels motorcycle club, in which he had allegedly stolen a significant amount of cash from a member's wallet and only returned the wallet after the money was removed. To taste him differently than don't tell the rest. It wasn't just a lie. It was a specifically constructed lie built around a real event, reversed and weaponized. He knew what had happened at Manny's roadside diner 3 weeks ago. He knew about the wallet, about Cole Maddox, about the whole thing. And they had taken that story, the one true good thing Ethan had done in months, and twisted it into something that made him look like a thief and a con man. His hands were not shaking this time. They were completely still. He felt the stillness all through him, the kind that comes before something rather than after it. He looked at the username attached to the post, Greed AZ Biz. Then the account had been created the same week the post went up. The other posts, no profile picture, no listed location. Ghost account, created for a single purpose. He stared at it for a long moment. He wrote the username down on the corner of a paper bag he had in his jacket pocket. He cleared the browser history, logged off the terminal, and walked out of the library, on the sidewalk outside with the paper bag in his hand, and thought carefully about what he was holding. Had been watching him closely enough to know about the diner. It meant either they had been in the diner that morning or they knew someone who had. They were not a stranger to him, even if he didn't know them yet. Close enough to have been watching for long enough. And the specific shape of what they were doing, the forum post, the calls ahead to employers, then the stolen backpack, erased documentation told him this was not impulsive. This was organized. This was someone who had done this before, with the practiced efficiency of a person who had learned from experience how to dismantle someone quietly. The question was why. He had nothing. He had no money, no property, influence, no connections worth weaponizing. There's no reason for someone to go to this much effort to destroy him unless his destruction was not the point, unless he was incidental, unless the point was something else entirely. He needed more information than he could get alone. He needed to make the call. He found a payphone 2 blocks from the library, one of the last ones in Phoenix that still worked, outside a laundromat on Roosevelt Street, whose owner had kept the thing going as a matter of stubborn principle. Ethan had used it before. He fished a quarter from his left jacket pocket and dialed the number on the back of the card. Once, Cole Maddox answered on the second ring as if he had been expecting it. He said. Ethan stood with the receiver pressed to his ear, prepared a short, careful opening statement, rehearsed it mentally 3 times on the walk over, planned to be concise and factual and unemotional. Instead, he said, someone is telling people I stole from your wallet. There's a pause on the other end. Not long. 3 seconds, maybe 4. 3 seconds. Ethan's heart moved in ways he had not expected. Cole said, I know. Ethan did not respond. I've heard it twice in the past week, Cole said. His voice was level. Different mouths, same story. Call you, because I was trying to figure out where it was coming from first, Ethan said, on the AZ BizTalk forum. That's the account. Pause. Shorter this time. Where are you right now? Cole asked. Roosevelt and 3rd. Outside the laundromat. Stay there, Cole said. 3 minutes. He hung up before Ethan could respond. Ethan hung up the receiver and stood in front of the laundromat. The machine inside moved in their slow, warm cycles. A woman folded something that might have been a child's shirt and sat in a plastic chair reading a newspaper. The world did exactly what it always did, entirely indifferent to the fact that Ethan Walker's life was being taken apart piece by piece by someone he couldn't yet name. He arrived in 22 minutes. He was driving a truck, black and low and practical. Not what Ethan had expected. Pulled to the curb and pushed the passenger door open from the inside. He said, Ethan got in. The truck was warm. Radio was off. Cole was looking straight ahead. Cole said, all of it. Start from after you left the diner. Ethan told him. All of it this time without editing for pride. The job applications, withdrawn offers. Secretly, Roy and the phone call, Patricia, and the employment system, Ethan, the stolen backpack, in the forum, post, username, the reversed story about the wallet. When he laid it out in sequentially, without dramatizing it, gone, because the facts were dramatic enough on their own. Cole listened the same way he had listened in the diner. Complete attention, no interruptions. When Ethan finished, Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Greed, you think that's a name? I think it's half a name, Ethan said. He did. Cole made a sound low in his throat. It was not quite a laugh and not quite a curse. Reed, he said. Ethan turned to look at him. Cole's jaw was tight. He's been around the edges of things for a while, Cole said. Not someone we've had direct trouble with, but his name comes up. Usually when someone is having problems they can't explain. You know him? Ethan said. I know of him, Cole said. There's difference. He's careful about that distinction. What does he want with me? Ethan asked. Cole turned and looked at him directly for the first time since he got in the truck. The question I've been trying to answer, he said. Because you have nothing he needs, which means you might be in the way of something you don't even know about. Statement landed with weight. In the way of what? Ethan said. No yet, Cole said, but I'm going to find out. He put the truck in drive. They drove for a while, without speaking. Ethan looked out the window. Phoenix spread itself flat and wide in every direction, a city that went on longer than it seemed like it should. He thought about Gavin Reed. He thought about being in someone's way without knowing there was something to be in the way of, about how vulnerable that made a person. Cole pulled up in front of a house in a North Phoenix neighborhood. Rich neighborhood, but a solid one, cared for yards. Older trees. The kind of street where people had lived for decades rather than years. Inside, Cole said. Ethan hesitated. I'm not asking you to be anyone's charity case, Cole said, reading the hesitation accurately. I'm asking you to be inside a warm building while we talk through a situation that involves both of us. Ethan got out of the truck. Inside the house, Cole made coffee in a kitchen that smelled like a kitchen rather than anything staged or deliberate. The kitchen of a household that functioned, where things were used and cleaned and used again. A woman's jacket hung near the door. Photographs covered the refrigerator. One recognized the wife and kids from the wallet photograph. He sat at the kitchen table. Cole sat across from him and put 2 mugs down between them. More about the backpack, Cole said. When exactly did it go missing? and what specifically was in it besides the folder. Ethan described the timeline and the contents again in detail. He listened and typed something on his phone. Ethan could see him scrolling and reading between questions, but not what was on the screen. Documents, Cole said. Certificates, employment history. Construct them. I can get copies from the state certification board, Ethan said. Transcripts from my training program. It takes time, but it's possible. Start that. Today, Cole said, I know someone at the state licensing office. In a favor kind of way. In a they owe me, a returned phone call kind of way. You doing this? Ethan asked. Cole set his mug down. Because what happened in that diner 3 weeks ago mattered, he said. And because someone is trying to make sure it never mattered. Because I don't accept that. He said it plainly, without emotion, as though it were simply a position he had established and had no interest in revisiting. Ethan looked at the mug in front of him. The coffee was good. Coffee, not the diluted stuff from the shelter urns. Something else, Ethan said. Say it. The forum post. Posted 3 weeks ago. Right after the diner. But the way it was written, it wasn't someone who was just watching me that one morning and got lucky. Details. Specific details about my employment history. The Flagstaff jobs. Specific shops I used to work at that someone would have had to dig for. Or already have. Cole was very still. Which means, Ethan said, either someone had been watching me for a while before the diner. I was already connected to something that connected to you. And neither of us knew it. Cole picked up his phone and dialed. It rang 4 times. Then a man answered. I need you to run a name for me, Cole said. Read. Phoenix area. Whatever you can get on how he operates, who he targets, and whether he's ever intersected with anyone in my network before this month. He paused. Danny, not next week. He hung up. He looked at Ethan. He said, but not long. They didn't wait long. Danny called back in less than 2 hours. Cole put the phone on speaker on the kitchen table without apology, which told Ethan that Cole had already decided he was part of this. Danny's voice was fast and flat, the voice of a man who processed information for a living and had removed all ceremony from the delivery of it. He said Gavin Reed was 44 years old, originally from Tucson, currently operating primarily out of Phoenix and the surrounding valley. He had 2 prior civil complaints filed against him. Both settled out of court, both involving accusations of fraud in the context of employment placement. He had a history of operating at the intersections of vulnerable populations, homeless individuals, veterans, recently unemployed workers, and community organizations. What does that mean? Operating at the intersections, Ethan said. Cole held up a hand, listening. Danny continued. Reed had a pattern, identified individuals who were trying to rebuild, specifically people with real skills and histories who were currently compromised by circumstance. He used them as leverage. Approach organizations or businesses with an offer. He could identify and deliver qualified workers for less than market rate because these workers were desperate enough to accept below standard arrangements. Workers resisted or tried to find independent employment. Reed would undermine them, cutting off their access to opportunities to maintain their dependency on him. Employment Center database, Danny said. Reed had a contact inside a staffing agency that had access to the A's BizTalk forum and several other local job networks. The contact was not identified yet, but the mechanism was clear. He's running a labor operation, Cole said. That's one way to put it, Danny said. And Walker here was finding his own way out, Cole said, which made him a problem. It's another way to put it, Danny said. Cole thanked him and ended the call. He sat back in his chair and looked at Ethan with an expression that was somewhere between grim and focused. You're not angry. Not Cole Maddox, Ethan was beginning to understand, did not waste energy on anger the way most people did. He converted it into something more functional. You're not his first, Cole said. Ethan said. He had already understood that from Danny's description. It was too practiced to be new. How many? Danny doesn't know yet. But a pattern like that organized, you're talking about years. Ethan sat with that. He thought about other men lying on shelter mats at night trying to figure out why the doors that should open were staying closed. He He thought about the particular desperation of someone who has real skills and real history and cannot understand why none of it is working. He had assumed his own situation was the product of circumstance and bad luck. Understanding that it was engineered sat in his chest like something cold and heavy. Specifically because of the diner, Ethan said. One, the story about the wallet that wasn't coincidence. One, he needed to cut off the one real connection I had made. Cole nodded. You walked into that diner and handed something back that you had every reason to keep. It tells a certain kind of person something specific about you. One, it tells them you have principles that override self-interest. A person like Reed, a person who survives by exploiting the desperate, looks at someone like that and sees a threat. Nothing, Ethan said. I was nobody. You were honest, Cole said. In his business, honest people are the most dangerous kind. The silence in the kitchen was different from the silence in the diner had been. That silence was heavy with 40 men's attention. This one was quieter and more specific. The silence of two people working through something together. Ethan said, what do we do? Cole said, first, we fix your situation. References, employment. I have contacts in the diesel industry in this city who owe me real conversations. Real conversations about a real mechanic who I am personally vouching for. Starts tomorrow. And Reed, Cole's expression did not change, is going to be a more deliberate process. What Danny described is not a conversation for two people at a kitchen table. That's going to require others. Ethan looked at him. Kind of others. Cole said, the kind that take things like this seriously. There are more of them than you might think. He stood up and carried both mugs to the sink. One. Ethan sat at the table for a moment longer. He looked at the photographs on the refrigerator. Cole's wife, smiling. His son in a baseball cap. His daughter holding the rabbit with one ear. About the moment in the parking lot when he had looked at those faces and felt his father's voice in his ear. You don't take what belongs to someone else. He had thought that decision was about honesty. He was beginning to understand. It was about something larger than that. Cole arranged for Ethan to stay in the spare room. He said it without making it a moment, without ceremony, just a practical statement that the spare room was available and Ethan was welcome to use it while they sorted through the situation. Ethan said, I told you I don't want charity. Cole said, good, because what I'm offering isn't charity. Charity is when someone gives you something you didn't earn. Getting is a working arrangement between two people who have a shared problem. Part of the problem is Reed targeting you. My part is that my name and my organization's name are being used in a lie that is actively circulating in this city, and that is not something I let go. He said it standing in the hallway outside the spare room door, with his arms crossed and his voice even, as though the logic of it should be entirely apparent. At him for a long moment. Okay, he said. Cole said. He turned and walked back down the hallway. His shoulder, there's an extra blanket in the closet if you need it. At night, Ethan lay in an actual bed for the first time in over 2 years. So the mattress was firm, and the sheets were clean, and the room was warm. The ceiling, and went over everything Danny had said, matching it against his own experience of the past 3 weeks. Fitting pieces together. Had been watching him before the diner. That was the part that kept returning. You don't set up an operation that fast on someone you only noticed 3 weeks ago, and went on. Which meant either Reed had been tracking Ethan for reasons connected to his job search, which would make sense if Reed had contacts inside the employment system and was monitoring certain profiles. He had been tracking someone connected to Ethan, and Ethan had simply crossed paths with that connection at the wrong moment. The right one. He thought about the wallet, about Cole, about the photograph. He fell asleep, still thinking. This morning, Cole was already on the phone when Ethan came out of the spare room. He was standing in the kitchen with his back to the hallway, speaking quietly, and Ethan caught only fragments. Need you to go back through the last 2 years and flag anything that matches the pattern Danny described. No, I mean everyone. Construction workers, everyone, who came through a shelter referral and then went quiet. I know it's a lot of names, Bobby. That's why I'm asking you and not someone else. He turned when he heard Ethan and held up two fingers in a gesture that meant both give me 2 minutes and pour yourself coffee, which Ethan did. Cole finished the call and set his phone face down on the counter. Rains, Cole said. He's connected to 3 veteran support organizations and 2 homeless outreach programs in the valley. Have him look for people who match Reed's pattern. More, Ethan said. Yes, Cole said. There are more. He poured his own coffee. How many more? Ethan asked. Cole was quiet for a moment. Bobby's going to take a few days, he said. Based on what Danny described about Reed's operation, we're looking at years of this. Of people, minimum, probably more. He said it without drama, just the plain weight of it. Thought about all the men he had seen in shelters, in employment lines, in doorways. Men with histories and skills and reasons. Men who had stopped trying to explain themselves because nobody was listening. And he thought about how easy it would be if you were the kind of person Reed apparently was to take that desperation and bend it into something useful to you. He's been hiding in plain sight, Ethan said. That's the only way that kind of operation works, Cole said. Looks twice at someone who presents as helpful. He set his coffee mug down. We're going to change that, he said, with the same even certainty he had used to say everything else. And Ethan was beginning to understand that this was simply how Cole Maddox operated. He did not raise his voice to indicate that something was serious. This itself was the signal. And underneath it, Ethan was starting to feel something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Just hope. Something harder than hope. Something harder than hope. Something that felt like the first real motion toward a fight he was actually going to win. Rains called back in 3 days. Cole took the call at the kitchen table, with Ethan sitting across from him, and he put it on speaker without being asked. It became the unspoken arrangement between them that whatever was developing here, Ethan was inside it, not adjacent to it. Bobby's voice came through, tired and tight. Not the tiredness of someone who had been lazy, of someone who had been working fast and found more than he expected. He went back 26 months, Bobby said. Cross-referencing intake records from the 3 vet programs and the 2 shelters against the employment database Patricia flagged, looking for the pattern you described, skilled workers. Documented histories, sudden unexplained loss opportunities after initial positive contact with employers. Cole said, what did you find? 17 names, Bobby said. It's just the ones I could document. There are gaps. People who didn't stay in the system long enough to track. People who moved on or gave up and left the valley entirely. But 17 confirmed cases where the pattern holds. Cole was quiet. Ethan stared at the phone. 17, Ethan said. Minimum, Bobby said. 2 of them are veterans. The guy, Marcus Teller, Army, prison, 2 tours, 1. Came back with a commercial vehicle certification and 3 years of logistics experience. He lost 6 job offers in 4 months. He's back in Tucson now, living with his sister, hasn't worked in the field in over a year. A woman named Sandra Okafor was a licensed electrician. Lost her license renewal application. Somehow it got submitted and then just disappeared in the system. And she's working retail now, making a third of what she should be earning. Bobby kept going. He named names and told stories in the clipped, visual way of someone who had spent too many hours in records and not enough distance from what he was reading. Every name was a person, and every person was a version of what had happened to Ethan, quietly dismantled by someone who knew exactly where to apply pressure. Bobby finished. The kitchen was very quiet. Cole said, does Reed's name appear anywhere in the documentation directly? Bobby said, he's careful. The contact inside the staffing agency is a woman named Christine Hollis. She's the thread. She's the one with access to the employment network, the one who flags candidates for Reed, the one who apparently makes the calls to employers. Stays 1 step removed. Smart, Cole said. Yeah, Bobby said. Smart and careful. And he's been doing it long enough to know where the edges are. Cole thanked him and ended the call. He sat back in his chair, looked at the ceiling for a moment, the particular look of a man running calculations behind his eyes. Then he looked at Ethan. 17, Ethan said again. You know of, Cole said. All of them had real skills, histories. All of them were trying. Yes, and none of them knew about each other. Leaned forward. That's how it works. Isolation is the weapon. You keep the targets separate, and they think they're the only one. They think the problem is personal, specific to them, something they did or something they are. They don't see the pattern because they can't see past their own situation long enough. Ethan thought about the shelter mat, about lying in the dark trying to construct logic out of what felt like personal failure, about specific, corrosive shame, of believing that you were the problem when the problem was someone else entirely. One has to tell them, Ethan said. Cole looked at him. Someone has to tell all 17 of them that it wasn't their fault, Ethan said. They weren't broken, that someone was working against them deliberately. He said it with a flatness that was not calm, but was something adjacent to it, the voice of a person who had located something important and was holding it very carefully. Cole said, "That's going to take more than 2 people at a kitchen table," Ethan said. Cole picked up his phone. He did not make one call. He made 7, back-to-back, each one brief and direct. Ethan sat and listened. The same structure, repeated with slight variations. Cole identifying the situation, naming Reed and Christine Hollis, describing the scope, and ending each call with the same sentence. Ethan, I need you to be part of this. As a favor, as a matter of what's right. Every call ended with a yes. Time, Cole set his phone down. Ethan had begun to understand something about the man sitting across from him. Maddox was not impressive because he was large, or because he led a motorcycle club, or because he had a reputation that walked into rooms before he did. It was impressive because when he said something was a matter of what was right, people believed him, because he was charismatic, because he was consistent, because he had spent decades being the same person in every room he entered. And that kind of consistency built something in people that no amount of charm ever could. It built trust. Who did you call? Ethan asked. 4 chapter officers across the valley, Cole said. Bobby, and a man named Frank Cordero, who was a detective with the Phoenix PD for 22 years, and now does private investigations for causes he considers worth his time. And this is worth his time? I told him what Reed has been doing, Cole said. He said, and I'm quoting directly, I've been waiting for someone to build a file on that man for 4 years, so yes, it's worth his time. For the first time, in longer than he could calculate. Something that felt close to dark humor moved through Ethan's chest. Not quite a laugh, but close to one. 4 years, Ethan said. Cole confirmed. Frank Cordero arrived the next morning. He was a compact, deliberate man in his early 60s, with the unhurried precision of someone who had spent a lifetime making sure he was right before he moved. He shook Ethan's hand with a grip that was firm without being performative and sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen that he uncapped before he said a single word. He looked at Ethan and said, "Start from the first moment you knew something was wrong, not from the diner. From the first moment you felt it." Ethan told the story again, but differently this time. Not the facts first, the feeling first. The way the rejections had a texture that was different from ordinary disappointment. Doors closed. Slightly faster than they should. Joy and the phone call. Patricia and the employment system. Post. The stolen backpack. He described the cumulative experience of being systematically undermined. And Frank wrote continuously. Not looking up, just writing. The scratch of his pen, the only sound in the room. When Ethan finished, Frank looked up. 3 specific things matter most for building a case, Frank said. 1. Christine Hollis and her access to the employment database. 2. The AZBiz Talk post and the account that created it. Direct testimony from at least 3 of the 17 people Bobby identified, specifically about communications they received or attempts Reed or Hollis made to approach them directly. 1. You think Reed approached some of them directly? Cole asked. That's how he closes the loop, Frank said. And undermining is stage 1. Stage 2 is the approach, or a proxy, makes contact with the target when they're at their lowest point and offers a solution, usually some kind of placement or arrangement that benefits Reed. The target is desperate enough to accept. That's how the labor operation functions. Mining isn't just malicious. It's recruitment strategy. Was very quiet for a moment, Ethan said. He was going to approach me. Frank looked at him. He hadn't yet. Ethan said slowly, working it through as he spoke. The trajectory. Undermine, isolate, then offer a way out. I found a different way out first. When I walked into that diner, made a note. That's important. The diner changed his timeline. You made a connection he hadn't anticipated. And instead of completing the recruitment cycle on you, he switched to damage control. The forum post, the accelerated undermining, that was him trying to cut the connection before it could become a resource for you. Leaned forward. Cole leaned forward, which means he knew enough about how I operate to understand what my involvement might mean for his business. Franks said, which tells us something about his awareness of the community landscape. He's been watching more than just the vulnerable populations. He's been watching the support structures around them too. It was the piece that made the whole picture sharper and worse. It wasn't just predatory. He was strategic in a way that implied real knowledge of the systems he was exploiting. Not just how to identify targets, but how to map the environment around them and neutralize potential help before it arrived. Ethan thought about the 17 names on Bobby's list. He thought about Marcus Teller in Tucson, living with his sister, 1 year of silence after a military career. He thought about Sandra Okafor, whose license application had simply disappeared inside a system too complex and too impersonal for anyone to notice one small, deliberate sabotage. The wallet gone. He thought about the wallet again. Something his father used to say came back to him. The hardest thing about doing the right thing isn't doing it. It's doing it when nobody's watching. Nobody had been watching in that parking lot. So he had thought. Reed had been watching. And Cole had been watching. A moment from entirely different directions. You do first. Ethan asked Frank. Frank set his pen down. First, we need to reach the 17 people on Bobby's list. And directly no intermediaries that could tip Reed off. We need voluntary statements from the ones willing to give them. We need to understand which of them had direct contact with Reed or Hollis beyond the passive sabotage. We need to do this fast. Because the moment Reed realizes we're building something, he'll move to protect himself. So, reach them without tipping him off. Cole asked. There's no contact, Frank said. Face to face, not digital. Bobby goes through his veteran channels. Someone else goes through the shelter referral networks. Emails, no forum posts, no database queries that Hollis might have eyes on. Nodded once. He looked at Ethan. Are you ready to be part of that? He asked. Not as a challenge, as a real question. Ethan thought about it for exactly the time it deserved, which was not long. He said, what followed were the most intense 10 days of Ethan Walker's life, which was a significant statement given that the previous 2 years had been no casual thing. Cole mobilized his chapter officers across the valley, and those officers mobilized their networks, and the network spread outward in careful, precise channels that had nothing to do with digital communication and everything to do with the old-fashioned reliability of people who trusted each other enough to show up in person. And when still, Bobby Raines reached out through the veteran programs and found Marcus Teller willing to drive back from Tucson the moment Bobby explained what they were building. So arrived on the third day, still carrying the specific posture of a soldier, the way the military trained the body to hold itself even when everything else had changed. He shook Ethan's hand at Cole's kitchen table and looked at him with eyes that recognized something. He told me, I was the problem, Marcus said. 4 months, his offers. Every single one fell apart right before it closed. A year trying to figure out what I was doing wrong, doing anything wrong. Ethan said. Marcus held his gaze for a long moment. He nodded once, and something in the set of his jaw that had been very tight for a very long time moved fractionally. Marcus said, Sandra Okafor came in on the 4th day. She was 38, sharp and quiet, with the precise way of speaking that electricians sometimes had detailed and measured. Nothing wasted. She had spent 14 months working retail. When Frank explained the mechanism by which her license renewal had been intercepted, she listened without interrupting and then sat for a moment in silence. She said, I want to testify. no drama, no anger in her voice, though the anger was there underneath it, controlled and purposeful. Tim, she said, I want to look at whoever is responsible for this and say it directly. We arranged that. Frank said, that's the goal. Sanders said, then tell me what you need from me. They came one by one over those 10 days. A construction foreman named Ray Diaz, who had lost a project management opportunity 3 years ago and never understood why. A young mother named Angela Voss, who was a certified pharmacy technician and had her certification mysterious lapse through a paperwork failure she had never been able to explain. A retired postal worker named Jean Hutchins, who was 61 and had tried to transition into fleet vehicle maintenance and been systematically blocked for 8 months before he gave up. The person sat at Cole's kitchen table or in Frank's car or in the back room of a veterans hall in North Phoenix and told their story. And each story's had the same texture at its core, the particular bewilderment of someone who had done everything right and watched it fail anyway, who had believed the failure was personal and carried it accordingly. When they heard each other's stories, the relief was almost painful to watch because nothing had been fixed yet, but because the thing they had each been carrying alone, the weight of unexplained failure, the private shame of it suddenly had a different shape. It's not a personal failing. It was a crime. And there is a profound and specific difference between those two things that changes everything about how a person stands. Built the file carefully. One, he had contacts inside the Phoenix PD, old partners who trusted his judgment. And he shared the developing picture with 2 of them informally, not as an official complaint yet, but as a conversation. The kind detectives have with people they respect when something is taking shape. A woman named Lieutenant Torres listened to what Frank described and said nothing for a long moment. She said, I want everything you have, on paper, organized, sourced. If what you're describing is accurate, this isn't just civil fraud. There are elements here that cross into criminal exploitation. He said, that's why I'm talking to you. On the 8th day, something shifted. Ethan was at the Veterans Hall with Bobby and Marcus when his phone, a prepaid one Cole had bought him on the 2nd day, rang with an unknown number, and he almost didn't answer. But something made him pick up. The voice on the other end was male, smooth, professionally modulated. The voice of a person who had spent years calibrating the precise register of trustworthiness. Ethan Walker, the voice said. Who is this? Ethan said. He looked at him. Ethan held up a hand. My name is Gavin Reed, the voice said. I think it's time we had a conversation. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Inside those 4 seconds, Ethan felt something move through him that was complicated and cold and absolutely clarifying. It was the voice behind 17 ruined opportunities. This was the voice that had reversed the story of the wallet and spread it through the city. This was the voice that had decided Ethan Walker was a problem to be managed. Now it was calling him directly. How did you get this number? Ethan said. His voice came out level. He was surprised by that. Sources, Reed said. The smoothness in his voice was practiced, but not quite perfect up close. Something underneath it. Not nervousness, exactly. Something more calculated. The tone of a man who was making a move he had made before and expected to work again. Ethan said. To help you, Reed said. You understand, you've been having difficulty finding employment. Specialize in connecting skilled workers with opportunities that match their experience. You're exactly the kind of candidate my network looks for. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. Bobby was watching him intently. Ethan caught his eye and mouthed a name, Reed. And Bobby was on his own phone, immediately calling Frank. You've been spreading lies about me, Ethan said into the phone. He kept his voice even, not accusing, stating. Reed didn't miss a beat. I don't know where you heard that, Ethan, I assure you. But, Eden, I'm not in the business of spreading anything. I'm in the business of solutions. Whatever you've been told about me, I'd encourage you to judge me by what I can actually offer you. It's good. You can hear exactly how good he was. Hear the architecture of the approach, the deflection, fit, the pivot frame, the be stealth offer. This This was a man who had done this enough times to know that the moment a target engaged with the offer, the dynamic shifted. Ethan did not engage with the offer. "I know what you did to Marcus Teller," Ethan said. And Sandra Okafor and Ray Diaz. The smoothness on the other end changed texture dramatically. A slight slowing, a slight recalibration, the way a machine sounds when a gear catches. "I'm not familiar with those names," Reed said carefully. Ethan said soon. He ended the call and was silent for a moment. Bobby stared at him. Who had heard the last exchange was on his feet. Called Cole. Cole picked up on the first ring. "He just called me," Ethan said. "He knows about this number." Starting to feel the pressure. "Good," Cole said immediately. "It means we're close enough that he's moving. Frank needs to know now. He's already calling him." "I'm also calling someone else," Cole said. "I'm working on something. And I wasn't ready to say it until I knew it was real. Ready to say it now." Ethan waited. Cole said, "I've been talking to chapter presidents across Arizona for the past week. Just mine, all of them. I told them what we're building, who Reed is, what he's done. And I asked every one of them the same thing I asked my 7 contacts on the first day." He paused. "How many?" Ethan said. "Right now," Cole said, "I have commitments from enough members to say that once this comes to its conclusion, when the people Reed has been hiding from finally get to be heard, they will not be standing alone." Ethan sat down. The chair beneath him was solid and real, and he needed it to be. He said, "How many?" Cole said, "Close to 480. The number hit him in the chest like something physical. 180 people who had never met Ethan Walker, who had no personal stake in his survival, who were willing to show up because Cole Maddox had made the same phone call. He always made, not asking for a favor, but asking for what was right. Ethan looked at his hands, the hands that had picked up a wallet in a parking lot and made the only decision that made sense, and had been paying for it ever since. He thought about the 17 people who had sat at Cole's table and in Frank's car and in the back room of a veterans hall and told their stories about the weight that had been on each of them. The private shame of failure that was never their failure. About how Reed's entire operation depended on keeping those people separate and small and convinced that their problem was personal. Still. And he thought about what 480 people showing up together did to that calculation. "What's the plan?" Ethan said. Cole's voice was steady and certain, the way it always was. "Bring everyone together," Cole said. "All 17. In all the testimony Frank has built. Lieutenant Torres. And whatever she's ready to move on officially. The person I've called who said yes." "When?" Ethan said. Cole said, "Reed made his move by calling you. It tells me he's feeling the edges closing in. We don't give him time to restructure," Ethan said. "And what does that look like when everyone comes together?" A lot pause. And in it, Ethan could hear the weight of what was being assembled. Ethan, all the moving parts, the people, all the stories that were about to stop being separate and become one single undeniable thing. Ethan, Cole said, "It looks like something Gavin Reed has never had to face before." He said it quietly, which was exactly how you said something that didn't need volume to be true. Days felt like 5 minutes and 5 years at the same time. He knew that sensation from his worst periods on the street, the way time compressed and expanded, depending on how much was at stake. When nothing mattered, days dissolved into each other without edges. Everything mattered. Every hour had weight and texture and a specific cost. 5 days had that quality. He felt each one. Cordero worked without stopping. Ethan watched him and understood, for the first time, what 2 decades of detective work actually looked like from the inside, not dramatic confrontations or cinematic revelations, but the patient, relentless accumulation of detail. Was at Cole's kitchen table every morning. By 7, when legal pad filled, pen moving at his ear, or face down beside his coffee, depending on whether he was calling or thinking. He had a system. He built the file the way a good mechanic built an engine. Nothing assumed, everything tested, every component verified before it was added to the structure. The second day, Frank had confirmed Christine Hollis's access to the employment network and documented 4 specific instances where employer callbacks had been intercepted or misdirected through her system access. 1. He had a former colleague at the PD running a quiet trace on the Greed AZ Biz account that had produced a registered IP address not Reed's home, but a coffee shop 2 miles from where Christine Hollis worked. Enough to be meaningful, careful enough to maintain deniability. The 3rd day, Lieutenant Torres had opened a preliminary inquiry, not a formal investigation, yet, but an open file with Torres's name on it, which Frank said was the most important step. Name is on a file, Frank told Ethan. Reed's options start shrinking. He's operating in the assumption that nobody official is paying attention. The moment that changes, everything about his calculus changes, Ethan asked. Frank considered this. He tried to disappear some things. Documentation, contacts, run. Physically, people like Reed don't run until the very last moment because they've always found a way out before and they believe they'll find one again. Ego is part of the operating system. Ethan thought about that phone call. The smoothness of Reed's voice. The complete absence of guilt in it, not because Reed felt no guilt, but because guilt was simply not a variable he included in his calculations. He had called Ethan as though nothing had happened, as though the months of deliberate sabotage were not a factor in their first conversation, as though the natural opening was simply an offer of help. He thought I'd say yes, Ethan said. Frank looked at him. When he called me, Ethan said. He genuinely believed there was a version of that conversation where I heard what he was offering and said yes, even after everything. Yes, Frank said. That's precisely how he's operated for 4 years. By the time he makes contact, the target has been reduced enough that the offer looks like rescue. He had someone who already knew what the offer actually was. Ethan sat with that. He thought about Sandra Okafor at the table, saying she wanted to testify. He thought about Marcus Teller, driving 2 hours from Tucson. He thought about Gene Hutchins, 61 years old, who had come in on the 6th day and sat down and said quietly, "Gone, everyone. I thought it was because I was too old. Spent 8 months believing nobody would hire me because I was too old." Gene had looked at his hands when he said it, and Ethan had recognized that look. When he had worn that look himself, the particular downward cast of a person who has located the blame inside themselves because they couldn't find it anywhere else. Isn't that Ethan had told him? I know that now, Gene had said. Knowing it now didn't fully erase the 8 months of believing it then, and they both understood that without saying it. On the 4th day, something happened that nobody had planned for. Cole's phone rang at 6:30 in the morning. He answered it. Everyone listened for 90 seconds without speaking, and then said, "Don't move. I'll be there in 20 minutes." He was already putting on his jacket and looked up from the kitchen table. What happened? Christine Hollis, Cole said. He was moving toward the door. She wants to talk. Ethan stood up. I'm coming. Cole looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then, get your jacket. He drove to a diner on the east side. Ethan, not Manny's one, a different one quieter and with fewer associations. Christine Hollis was already there when they arrived. She was in her mid-40s, small and precise, in the way of someone who had spent years managing complex systems, and she was sitting in the back corner booth with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug as though she needed the warmth. She looked up. When Cole and Ethan walked in, her eyes moved between them once, measuring. Cole slid into the booth across from her. Ethan sat beside Cole. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Christine said, "He called me yesterday." "He called you?" She was looking at Ethan. "He told me to purge certain records from the staffing database. Employment history, employer contact logs. Things that would close loops." Cole said, "No," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. Making copies instead. For 6 months, the air in the booth changed. Ethan looked at her. "It's months," Cole said. Christine nodded. "I knew what I was doing when I started helping him. Well, I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The money was he paid well, and I told myself the people being affected would find other ways. It wasn't really harm." She stopped. She looked at her coffee. And then I saw the list Bobby Raines was building. Told Reed about Bobby. He told me.
Seth,
And he was irritated about it, but not worried yet. And I looked at the names, and I recognized them. 17 people I had processed. 17 applications I had flagged. She looked up. Sandra Okafor's license renewal, she said. Routed that. I told myself it was just a delay. File. It would get sorted. I didn't think about what 14 months of lost income at that level actually meant for a person. Her jaw tightened. It was wrong. I was specifically, deliberately wrong, and I knew it, and I kept going anyway. Stop now, Ethan asked. He kept his voice level. He did not make it easy for her, but he did not make it hostile either. It as a real question. Christine looked at him. Reed told me to purge the records, she said. He used a phrase. He said it was time to clean the house before the guests arrived. And the way he said it, the way he said guests us, I understood that he wasn't worried. That he genuinely believed that whatever was building, he could walk through it and out the other side the same way he always had. She paused, and something about that was the thing that finally broke through my conscience on its own. The specific realization that he would do this again, to 17 more people, and 17 more after that, because he had never once been made to stop. Cole said, "What do you have?" Months of copied records, Christine said. Transaction logs showing the specific employer contacts I made on his behalf. Financial records he paid me through a consulting LLC, which means there's a paper trail. Internal messages between us, which I preserved before he could think to scrub them. 3 recorded phone calls from the past 2 months that I made on my personal phone during conversations, where he gave me specific instructions. Cordero was going to want to adopt this woman. Ethan thought, not literally, but professionally. Cole took out his phone and called Frank without leaving the table. He summarized what Christine had just described in approximately 45 seconds. His response on the other end was brief and immediate. Cole says, "Don't move anything. Don't delete anything." You tell Reed, anything has changed. He's going to connect you with Lieutenant Torres today. You do that? Christine said. Yes. Are you prepared for what comes after? Ethan asked. He looked at him again. She seemed to understand that he was not asking about legal consequences. He was asking something more personal than that. I cost 17 people real portions of their lives, she said. After is what I've got coming. She said it without self-pity and without performance. She said it the way people say things they have already worked through, alone in the dark, and come out the other side of. Ethan nodded. They left the diner. In the truck on the way back, Cole drove and said nothing for several minutes. And he said, "That changes the shape of tomorrow significantly," Ethan said. Before Christine came forward, we had a strong circumstantial case and powerful testimony. We didn't have was the mechanism, documented proof of how Reed operated, in his own words, on record. Cole's voice was measured. We have that. Which means Torres can move on this officially, not just preliminarily. Which means Reed's margin disappears. He's going to know something changed, Ethan said. Stops responding the way he expects. Yes, Cole said, which is why tomorrow can't wait. He picked up his phone and called the first of the chapter presidents. Morning, the 5th day, the day Cole had named, began before dawn. Awake before his alarm, which was standard now. His body had recalibrated to something close to military hours, pushed by the urgency of the past week. He sat on the edge of the bed in the spare room and thought through the sequence of the day the way Frank had laid it out. This would move on Christine's documentation officially at 9 in the morning, which would give Reed's contacts inside whatever network he used advance. Notice that a formal inquiry was live. Simultaneously, Frank would deliver the complete file testimony records. Financial documentation, recorded calls to Torres's office directly. The goal was to close the information gap before Reed could react. At the same time, Bobby Raines would be contacting each of the 17 people personally calls he had already prepared for, with each person knowing they might receive it that morning and understanding what it meant. Ethan and the Hells Angels. Cole had not overstated the number. Ethan had spent the past 2 days watching Cole's phone become a constant stream of confirmations. Chapter officers calling in, names added to a shared list that Frank and Bobby were cross-referencing against the outreach plan. Count had settled at 483 members across 7 Arizona chapters who had committed to showing up in support of the victims, to be present when the testimony was delivered, to stand as visible, unmistakable proof that the people Reed had kept isolated and small were not isolated anymore and had not been small to begin with. 483 men and women who had no personal stake in Ethan Walker's survival, except the one Cole had given them, that it was a matter of what was right. When Ethan went to the kitchen, Cole was already there. Coffee was already made. They sat across from each other and drank it and didn't fill the silence with anything it didn't need. For a while, Ethan said, "I want to be the one who tells them." One looked at him. "The 17, Ethan," said. "When everyone comes together, I want to be the one who stands up first. Frank before Torres, before anyone an official. The first voice they hear to be mine." Cole held his gaze. "Because I was one of them," Ethan said, "and nobody stood up first for me. I had to find my own way to that diner. Most of them never found their way at all. If someone had told me early on, not a lawyer, Ethan, not a detective, someone who had been through the same thing, that it wasn't my fault, that I wasn't broken, that someone was working against me deliberately," he stopped. "Change something. Even if nothing else was fixed yet, change something." Cole was quiet. Then he said, "Yes," just the one word. They arrived at the community center on the north side at 8:30 and had arranged the space through a contact 3 days earlier, saying only that it was needed for a community meeting of significant size. Staff had looked at the name on the rental agreement and not asked further questions. Was already there with his file. It arrived at 8:45 in plain clothes, which she had chosen deliberately. She was there as a person first, and as a lieutenant second. We wanted the room to understand that distinction from the beginning. Bobby brought the veterans Marcus Teller and 4 others from the program who had agreed to come. Okafor drove herself and arrived precisely on time with the expression of someone who had been ready for this for longer than the past 10 days. Hutchins came with his wife, a small woman named Pauline who held his hand and sat beside him without speaking, and whose presence said everything about what 8 months of unexplained failure had cost a household. Voss brought her daughter, who was 7, and had no idea what the room was for, and sat in a chair with a book while the adults around her prepared to do something she would understand better when she was older. Diaz came last, 3 minutes before 9. Everyone, walking fast with his jacket half buttoned, and took the first open seat he saw and looked around the room with the expression of a man who had driven 40 minutes not entirely sure what he was driving toward. Between 8:58 and 9:04, the sound started. Ethan was standing near the front of the room when he heard it. A low rumble that built gradually, the specific acoustics of many engines in proximity. Aggressive, not theatrical, just present. The way a river sounds when it's moving with full force and full purpose. Through the walls of the community center, sound grew and then settled into a collective idle when cut to silence. In the silence, after that many engines went quiet, simultaneously was its own kind of statement. Diaz was on his feet. He was looking at the window. "What is that?" He said. "That," Bobby said quietly, "is 483 people who showed up because Cole Maddox made some phone calls." Ray stared at him. Gene Hutchins' wife, Pauline, made a sound that was almost not a sound at all, a small, exhaled breath, like something she had been holding for a long time. Cole walked in from the side entrance. He moved through the room without ceremony, acknowledged Frank and Torres with brief nods, and came to stand beside Ethan. He said quietly, "You're up first." Ethan looked at the faces in the room. 18 people, most of whom he had met in the past 10 days, and some he had not yet spoken to directly. Ages, different histories, different degrees of damage done, but the same thing underneath all of it, the same specific wound that came from believing a lie about themselves. He walked to the front. He did not have notes. He had not prepared a speech, not in the formal sense. He had was the knowledge of what it felt like to be where these people had been, and the understanding, and then that the most useful thing he could say was the simplest thing. He looked at them and said, "My name is Ethan Walker. A few weeks ago, I was sleeping on a mat in a shelter and trying to figure out why I couldn't get hired when I had 8 years of certified experience. I thought I was the problem. I want to start by telling you that I wasn't, and neither were you." The room was completely quiet. "Someone built a system designed to make us believe we were failing on our own terms," Ethan said. "Step worked because we were separated. We couldn't see each other, so we couldn't see the pattern. We just saw our own version of the same wall." He looked at Gene Hutchins, Sandra Okafor, at Marcus Teller, who was sitting very straight with his jaw set. "My way out because of a wallet," Ethan said. "Stupid coincidence. I was in the right parking lot at the right moment, and I made one decision, and it connected me to one person who actually listened." He paused. "Most of you never had that moment, and I've been thinking about that every day for the past week, because you deserved it just as much as I did. You worked just as hard, just as honest. The difference between you and me isn't character or effort or ability, is a parking lot." Marcus Teller looked at his hands. He looked up. Angela Voss had put a hand over her mouth. Gene Hutchins' wife, Pauline, had both of hers pressed flat on the table in front of her, and she was looking at Ethan with an expression that he recognized the look of someone who had been waiting a very long time to hear exactly those words. "Today," Ethan said, "that changes. You're going to hear from Frank Cordero, who has built a file that documents what was done to you and who did it. You're going to hear from Lieutenant Torres, Tias, who is here officially and who has already opened a formal inquiry. This building right now, there are 483 people who came because someone asked them to, and because they believed it was worth coming for." Stopped. "You are not alone," he said. "You haven't been since you walked into this room. Who spent 4 years keeping you that way is running out of places to hide." Silence after he stopped. Speaking lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Marcus Teller stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood. And then Ray Diaz stood, and Sandra Okafor. One, Gene Hutchins with Pauline still holding his hand. One by person in the room came to their feet. One, and the standing was not applause. It was not performance. It was something quieter and more fundamental. The physical expression of people who had been made small, deciding together to take up their full space again. Caught Ethan's eye from across the room and gave him a brief, precise nod. Torres was already opening her folder. Ethan stepped back and let the room do what it needed to do next. The testimony took 4 hours. Frank had structured it carefully, not chronologically but thematically, so that the pattern Reed had used became visible across the individual stories, rather than being lost inside them. Person spoke. Some briefly, some at length, all of them with the particular clarity of people who had been waiting for the chance to say something true in a room that would believe them. Dean Hollis testified remotely, connected through Frank's laptop, her face on a small screen at the corner of the table. She spoke carefully and completely, naming what she had done and how Reed had directed it and where the documentation could be found. In the room was warm toward her. But nobody interrupted her either, because what she was saying was what they needed her to say, and the people in this room were too practical to confuse complicated feelings with practical necessity. He made his move. At 11:43 in the morning, his phone buzzed. He looked at it, read something, and passed the phone to Torres without changing his expression. He read it. Her expression didn't change either. He passed the phone back. "What?" Cole said. "Reed filed an injunction this morning," Frank said, to a civil attorney. "He's attempting to preemptively challenge the credibility of the testimony on the grounds that the witnesses were organized and coached by a third party, meaning Cole, with financial interest in the outcome. Registered this in various ways. Ray Diaz said something short and profane. Okafor's expression went very flat and focused in a way that was more dangerous than anger. Teller said nothing and went very still, which Ethan had learned in the past 10 days meant he was processing something at a level that would produce a specific and effective response. Ethan said, "He's still trying." "Of course he is," Frank said. "This is his pattern. When direct operation fails, he shifts to legal obstruction. He's used it before twice, both times successfully enough to delay proceedings until witnesses became exhausted or moved on." "We'll get tired," Ethan said. "He's counting on it." One picked up his phone. He made one call. It lasted 40 seconds. And when he ended it, he set the phone down and looked at Frank. "The attorney," Cole said. "He's been on standby for 2 days. He says the injunction has no legal standing because Christine Hollis's documentation establishes an independent evidentiary basis that predates any organized response. The financial interest claim is frivolous because I have no financial relationship with any of the complainants." He said it the way he said everything, even, certain, final. "To respond to the injunction?" Torres asked. "Before end of business today," Cole's attorney had apparently said. Seconds was enough for that. Torres nodded. She picked up her phone and made her own call, and what she said into it shifted the morning from preliminary inquiry to active investigation status in approximately 90 seconds. Its injunction, it turned out, had one significant flaw beyond its lack of legal merit: naming the parties he was challenging, which meant creating an official legal record of his awareness of the testimony and his attempt to prevent it from being heard. Pointed this out to Torres with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had anticipated exactly this move. 1. He just documented his own knowledge of the investigation, Frank said, while attempting to obstruct it. Torres said, "I know." He almost smiled. At 2 in the afternoon, Torres received a call that she took in the hallway. She was gone for 6 minutes. When she came back, her expression was composed, but there was something different in the set of it. She said, "Christine Hollis's records have been authenticated by our digital forensics team. Financial documentation has been cross-referenced with Reed's LLC filings. The recorded calls have been analyzed and verified." She paused. "We have enough to move formally." Today, the room received that in silence. Gene Hutchins said, very quietly, "It's real." Question. Something he was saying to himself, testing whether it would hold. Eileen covered his hand with hers. "It's real," Ethan said. It was. The thing they had built over 10 days, the testimony, the documentation. One, Frank had assembled piece by piece, with the patience of someone who understood that the only way to defeat a careful operation was with something more careful, was real and present and official and moving. Its margin had not just shrunk, it had collapsed. The engine stayed quiet. 483 people stayed. Ethan stood near the back of the room and watched Frank and Torres work through the final sequence of the file. Watched Marcus Teller answer follow-up questions with the precision of a soldier giving a report. One. Watched Sandra Okafor correct a detail in the documentation with the ease of someone who had been living with these facts long enough to know them perfectly. He thought about the parking lot, the cold morning, the wallet beside the tire of the last bike in the row, about how close he had come to walking past it, picking it up and keeping it. How easy that would have been, completely understandable. How nobody who knew his situation would have judged him for it. He thought about his father's voice, which was the reason he hadn't, which was the reason any of this existed. Cole came to stand beside him. "What are you doing?" Cole asked. "I don't know yet," Ethan said. "I think I won't know for a while." Cole nodded. That was an acceptable answer. "There's one more thing," Cole said. He said it in a tone that made Ethan turn and look at him. Cole said, "Danny ran a deeper trace on Reed's operation this morning, before this started. He found something that changes the picture in a way we haven't discussed yet." Ethan waited. "Reed wasn't operating alone," Cole said. "Christine was one layer. There's another layer above her. Someone who was providing Reed with the initial target lists, the intake databases, the veteran program records, the shelter referrals. Someone with institutional access that Christine didn't have." Ethan felt something go cold in his chest. "Who?" he said. We don't have a name yet. Danny is still tracing. The access pattern points to someone inside one of the organizations that's supposed to be helping people, like the 17 in this room, one who was identifying the most vulnerable candidates and feeding them to Reed's system from the very beginning of it, settled over Ethan slowly. Someone inside a help organization. Someone whose job was to connect struggling people with resources, using that position to identify targets for a man who turned their desperation into leverage. It's the root, Ethan said. Yes, Cole said. And if we don't find it, we've stopped Reed, Cole said. But not the system that was feeding him. Which means the next person who does what Reed did will have the same infrastructure available. Ethan looked at the room. At 17 people who had come to today because someone had finally told them the truth. Was working through a file that had taken 10 days to build. He thought about all the people who hadn't made it into this room, the ones who had left the valley, gone quiet, disappeared into different cities, different lives, with the weight of unexplained failure still on them. You find it, Ethan said. It was not a question. Cole said, yes, you do. And in the way he said it, the same evenness, the same certainty, the same absence of doubt that Ethan had been watching for 10 days, Ethan understood that this was not over. Not yet. What had happened today was real and significant and would have consequences that were already moving. Full truth was still one layer deeper, and they were going to dig until they found it. Danny called at 6:17 the following morning. Ethan heard Cole's voice change in the next room, not louder, alarmed. Ethan, but tighter, one. The specific compression of a man receiving information that confirmed something he feared was true. One. Ethan was already sitting up when Cole appeared in the doorway of the spare room. Fully dressed, phone still in his hand, Cole said. Danny found the source. Ethan was on his feet before Cole finished the sentence. In the truck, 8 minutes later. Cole drove and talked. At the same time, something Ethan had learned he only did when the information was too urgent to sequence. The access pattern Danny traced goes through a nonprofit called Arizona Pathway Forward, Cole said. 3 resource centers in the valley: employment assistance, housing, referrals, veteran outreach. Legitimate organization, been running for 11 years. Decent reputation. One inside it, Ethan said. The director of intake services, Cole said. Leonard Pruitt. He's been there 9 years. But Danny tracked the data access pattern backward through the employment network and found a recurring export of intake records, specific records, when workers in transitional circumstances being pulled under Pruitt's credentials and routed through an encrypted that dead ends at the same LLC structure Reed used for his payments to Christine. Ethan processed this. Pruitt was identifying targets, Ethan said, from inside the help system. From the first point of contact, Cole said, people come into Pathway Forward looking for help. They fill out intake forms. They disclose their skills, their histories, their vulnerabilities, all of it designed to match them with resources. And Pruitt was taking that information and selling it to Reed before those people ever got a resource referral. The specific horror of it was not abstract. Ethan thought about every person on Bobby's list, every one of those 17 people, and however many more that hadn't made it onto the list, walking into a place that advertised itself as help. Trusting it with their most private circumstances, their most desperate truths. And he thought about filling out a form and believing it would connect him to something that would pull him forward. And instead, it was being used to engineer his failure. People went through Pathway Forward. Ethan said, jaw was tight. Danny still calculating. But based on the volume of records exported under Pruitt credentials over 4 years, we're talking about potentially hundreds of intake clients whose information was shared with Reed. Not 17. Hundreds. Ethan looked out the window. Said he was waking up around them, indifferent as always. And he sat inside the fact of hundreds of people who had gone to a place called Pathway Forward, looking for a path forward, and instead had been handed quietly and deliberately to a man who would use their desperation as a resource. Needs to know, Ethan said. Frank is calling her right now, Cole said. Danny sent the documentation directly to Frank's encrypted email at 5 this morning. Frank has had it for over an hour. Why didn't you wake me? Cole glanced at him briefly. Because you needed 2 hours of sleep, more than you needed to lie awake with this for 2 hours. There's nothing you could do before now. It was practical and correct. And Ethan recognized both of those things without being entirely grateful for them. Dose agent. They pulled into the parking lot of Frank's office building. Frank was waiting outside with his coat on and his legal pad under his arm, which meant he had been outside for a while, which meant he had been thinking through something that required movement. He got the back of the truck without preamble. Pruitt knows, Frank said immediately. He went still. How? Ethan said. Reed, Frank said. Torres moved yesterday, and the inquiry went active. Reed made contact with Pruitt. Danny intercepted a text message sent through the relay system at 11:48 last night, told Pruitt to shut down his access credentials and prepare to deny any knowledge of data exports. Did Pruitt do it? Cole asked. He tried to revoke his credentials remotely. At 12:03 this morning, Frank said, network administration at Pathway Forward logs all credential changes, and Danny already had a mirror of the Access S logs before Pruitt moved. Attempt to revoke actually creates an additional layer of evidence. It establishes consciousness of guilt. He panicked, Cole said. Reed panicked first, Frank said. Pruitt followed. Which is the worst thing either of them could have done. A sophisticated response would have been to sit still and let the legal machinery work slowly. Instead, they moved and moving left fingerprints. Ethan thought about the injunction Reed had filed the previous morning. In pattern, when pressure arrived, Reed moved to obstruct rather than to wait, and every move he made left another record, Ethan said. Frank looked at him. You said it before, Ethan said. People like Reed believe they'll find a way out because they always have. So when the exit they expected doesn't appear, they don't go still. They escalate. And escalating is exactly what gives you what you need. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a precise Reed. Got a week to study him, Ethan said. Frank almost smiled. Torres is moving on Pruitt this morning. She has enough for a formal interview and a warrant for Pathway Forward's records and from the State Attorney General's office, which means this is no longer just a Phoenix P matter. The AG Cole said, when the scope involves a nonprofit receiving state funding and potentially hundreds of victims, it becomes a state matter, Frank said. See, made that call last night after Danny's information came through. Again, Cole was quiet for a moment, watched him process the expansion of the situation, the way something that had started with one man and a wallet in a parking lot had grown into something that now involved two men, a structured criminal operation, a nonprofit betrayal, and the office of the Attorney General of Arizona. It was bigger than we thought, Cole said. It was always bigger, Frank said. We just couldn't see the full shape of it until we were inside it far enough. They drove to the community center, Ethan. Not because anything was scheduled there that morning, because it had become a kind of base where the past 10 days of work had concentrated itself on, and it felt right to be in proximity to it. Bobby was already there with Marcus and 3 of the other veterans. Come, without being called, which told Ethan something about what the previous day built. A group of people who had been isolated by design, now moving with the instinct of community. Again, without being asked. Because being checked in and asked, because being checked in on had turned out to matter more than any of them had known how to say. Just looked at Ethan when they walked in. What happened? He said. The room in the efficient way. He read the room in the efficient way of someone trained to read environments quickly. Cole told them. All of it Pruitt, the way forward, pathway for hundreds of potential victims. The Attorney General. He said it plainly, without drama, because the facts were dramatic enough on their own. Received it the way the room had received everything over the past 10 days. With shock. With the specific quality of people encountering something that is terrible but not surprising, because they had already understood the depth of what was being done to them, and the revelation of an additional layers was painful but not incomprehensible. Said, pathway forward. Yes, Cole said. I went there, Marcus said. Quiet, very still. 14 months ago, one of the veteran program referrals filled out an intake form. I listed my certifications, my logistics experience, my housing situation. He stopped. 6 weeks later, the job offers started falling apart. He said anything. Marcus looked at the table. His hands were flat on it, and Ethan could see the effort it took to keep them there, not from anger, but from the specific internal work of a person rearranging their understanding of something they had already been through. It was the gap on my resume, Marcus said. Employment gap. I thought civilian employers were looking at it and deciding I was too much of a transition risk. He looked up when I spent 14 months believing that. Ray Diaz said, I went there too, 2 years ago. Bobby was writing names on his legal pad before the sentence was finished. Okafor said, I didn't, but my friend did. She's in Albuquerque now. Gave up her license renewal entirely and moved. Give Bobby her contact information, Frank said. She's willing to be part of this record. Her name matters. When Sandra was already reaching for her phone, the morning moved fast. Called Frank at 9:22 to confirm the warrant for Pathway Forward's records had been approved and executed. Pruitt had been formally interviewed and had invoked his right to an attorney within the first 4 minutes of the conversation, Frank said, was a legally appropriate response, and also the response of a man who understood exactly what the questions were going to reveal. His attorney filed a response to Torres's active investigation at 10:15, a dense document challenging the evidentiary basis of Christine Hollis's testimony on the grounds that she was a conspirator with motive to minimize her own liability. Legitimate legal argument, and Torres's office had anticipated it, which was why the financial documentation and the recorded calls had been authenticated independently of Christine's verbal testimony. He read the filing on his phone and said, his attorney is good. It's going to be slower than a clean case. How slow? Cole asked. Months, Frank said. Possibly longer before a trial if it goes to trial. Components could run parallel and faster. Ethan said. What about the people? The ones who went through Pathway Forward? Of them. Frank looked at him. The legal process protects future victims, Ethan said. Holds Reed and Pruitt accountable. But it doesn't fix what happened to the ones who are already gone. The ones who moved away, who gave up their licenses, who decided they were the problem and stopped trying. Frank was quiet. I know, he said. That's not what the law is built for. And what is it built for? Ethan said. Then not aggressively. No question. Consequence, Frank said. The law is built to assign consequence. You're describing repairing what was done to people. That's a different thing. T. Sherry. It's necessary and it's real, but it requires a different kind of structure. Cole said. Frank looked between them. Community outreach. Direct contact with former Pathway Forward clients, specifically those flagged in the intake export records, once Torres's team has access to Pruitt's full database. What was done? Giving them the information to understand their experience wasn't their failure. Connecting them with real resources, actual resources, not Reed's version. It was months of work, Bobby said. Yes, Frank said. You do it. Ethan said. Nobody argued. Cole looked at him and then looked at the room. Marcus and Ray and Bobby and the veterans and the space that had become. Over 10 days, something none of them had planned for it to become, Cole said. The second twist came from a direction none of them had predicted, which was the definition of the kind of twist that changed everything. 11:40. In the morning, a woman walked into the community center. She was 63 years old, with white hair and the kind of deliberate composure that comes from spending decades managing large amounts of anxiety in public settings. Her name was Miriam Cross, and she was the executive director of Arizona Pathway Forward. She had driven herself. She had not called ahead. She had not brought an attorney. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room until her eyes found Frank Cordero, whose name and face she apparently knew. Trying to understand what Leonard Pruitt has been doing in my organization for 4 years, she said. When I think you have information, I don't. Frank stood up. he said. She sat at the table. She held her hands in her lap, and she did not perform composure. She actually had it, the real kind that coexists with visible distress rather than replacing it. She had clearly been crying at some point in the past few hours. Showed it. Her voice did not. I hired Leonard Pruitt 9 years ago, she said. Came with strong references and a genuine understanding of intake processes. Effective. I trusted him with the systems because he was competent and because I had other things to manage. She paused. The explanation, not the excuse. What do you know? Frank asked. We got a call this morning. From our network administrator, she said. He told me that Terrace's office had executed a warrant and was requesting our records. When I pulled Pruitt's access logs myself, and I saw the export pattern. She stopped, hands tightened in her lap. He was using my intake system to feed people to someone who would then destroy its opportunities, people who came to us. She said it with the specific weight, who had built something over years, with the genuine intention of helping, and was sitting with the knowledge that what they built had been used as a hunting ground. Many of our clients, she said, Frank said. We don't have a final count yet. The export logs go back 4 years. Torres's team is working through the database now. Jim Cross closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she opened them. What do you need from me? She said. Not from Pathway Forward as an organization. Me, personally. What can I do that helps the people who were hurt? And that was the moment that changed the shape of everything again. Because Miriam Cross controlled the client database. She controlled 11 years of resource networks, community partnerships, employer relationships. The libis mistil, she controlled legitimacy and the trust that Pathway Forward had built before Pruitt had corrupted the machinery from the inside. When she was sitting at this table, not as a defendant, and not as a bystander, but as a person asking what she could do. Ethan looked at her. He thought about the intake form she hadn't known was a trap. He thought about Marcus and his deployment gap and 14 months of wrong conclusions. He thought about Sandra's license and Ray's project management opportunity, and Gene Hutchins believing for 8 months that the world had decided he was too old. He said, the people who went through your intake system and then had their opportunities destroyed, we need to reach them, one we can find. We need to tell them what happened, and we need to connect them with real help. Employers, real resources, real pathways that Reed and Pruitt didn't have their hands on. Jim looked at him. You're the man from the diner, she said. Yes, Ethan said. Cole Maddox told me about you, she said. Directly. But the story traveled. She held his gaze. You returned a wallet with enough cash to change your situation completely, Ethan said. And what you're asking me to do now is use every resource I have to repair damage done under my roof without my knowledge. As Ethan said, she nodded once, precisely. Then that's what I'll do, she said. What followed over the next 6 weeks was not a clean story. The clean stories were. For people who didn't have to live inside them. What actually happened was complicated and slow and sometimes exhausting and occasionally infuriating. It also, beneath all of that, the most real thing Ethan Walker had ever been part of. Torres's investigation expanded formally into a joint inquiry with the state attorney general's office. Reed was arrested on day 14. The charges were significant wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, exploitation of vulnerable adults, trafficking in the 3rd degree. His attorney was good, and the process was going to be long. But the file Frank had built was real, and the documentation Christine Hollis had preserved was real, and the testimony of 23 people, the original 17 plus 6 more, found through Miriam's database was real. Things had a weight that legal maneuvering could delay, but could not ultimately dissolve. Pruitt cooperated on day 9, which surprised nobody who understood how these structures worked. When the person at the top of a chain is arrested, the person one link down typically makes a rapid calculation about self-preservation. Pruitt's cooperation confirmed the full scope of the operation and added 12 additional victims to the documented record. He also confirmed, and what Danny had suspected, that he had been approached by Reed, not the other way around, which meant Reed had identified the intake infrastructure as a resource and deliberately recruited someone inside it, and patient and methodical, all the way down. Dean Hollis reached a cooperation agreement with the Attorney General's office on day 11, because the penalties were significant and the professional consequences were permanent. So that before she walked into the diner, and she had come anyway, Cross spent the 6 weeks doing exactly what she said she would do. Her recent networks, her employer relationships, her 11 years of community trust, and pointed all of it at the repair work staff, most of whom had known nothing about Pruitt's operation and had been working genuinely and effectively in a system being corrupted underneath them, themselves into the outreach with the specific energy of people who needed to do something that mattered because the alternative was too hard to sit with. 89 former clients in 6 weeks. 9 people scattered across the valley and beyond in Tucson, in Albuquerque, in Las Vegas, in cities they had moved to after Phoenix didn't work out the way they had planned. 9 people who received a call or a visit or a letter that said in simple language, "What happened to you was not your fault. Someone was working against you deliberately. Here is what we know. This is what we can offer now if you want it." Not all of them wanted it. Them had built different lives. Some of them had built gardens in the places, and reopening the Phoenix chapter was not something they were willing to do. And understood that without judgment. The cost of rebuilding hope after it had been specifically engineered out of you was not a cost everyone could pay twice. But 41 of them said yes. 41 people who took the resources Miriam Cross's organization now offered in good faith, who connected with employers Cole's network had personally vetted, who went through certification renewal processes that Frank's contacts in the state licensing office had fast-tracked wherever legally possible. Teller had a job offer on day 22, logistics coordinator for a commercial vehicle fleet in Phoenix. The manager was a man in his 50s who had done 2 tours in the Gulf and had a strict policy of not making veterans jump through hoops they had already earned their way past. He called Marcus directly after Cole's recommendation and said, "I don't need your gap." Explain. "I need to know if you can do the job." Marcus told him yes. He started on day 29. Okafor's license renewal went through on day 18 with the help of a state licensing official who had been quietly furious about the systemic pattern of mysteriously failed applications for 2 years and was grateful to finally have a documented mechanism to point at. She took a lead electrician position on a commercial renovation project starting day 31. She sent Ethan a text that said only, "Back where I belong." He read it 4 times. Gene Hutchins got a part-time position doing fleet vehicle maintenance for a small delivery company whose owner, a woman named Carla, who had heard the story through the Pathway Forward network, one called him personally and said, "I don't care about the gap. I care that you know what you're doing. Do you know what you're doing?" Gene said he did. He said, "Good." Monday morning, Pauline cried when Gene told her. The kind said crying. The kind that comes when a weight that has been on a household for a long time finally lifts enough that the body doesn't know what to do with the absence of it. Ethan. On day 31, Cole brought him to a commercial diesel shop on the north side of Phoenix. Favor, not charity. A professional introduction to the owner, a man named Dale, who had been in the industry for 25 years and who Cole had called 3 weeks earlier and said, "I know a mechanic, 8 years experience, one of the best diagnosticians I've heard described in this industry. His situation has been complicated, and I'm asking you to take one conversation." Dale had said, "One conversation." The conversation lasted 45 minutes. Everyone asked specific questions about specific problems, the kind of diagnostic questions that can't be faked, that require real experience and real knowledge and real years of hands-on work. Ethan answered them with the ease of someone returning to a language he had always spoken but had been forbidden to use for too long. And Dale said, "You're not rusty. No, Ethan said. Years on the street, and you're not rusty. I kept myself sharp, Ethan said. I talked to anyone working in the field who'd talk to me. Couldn't afford to get rusty. Dale looked at him for a long moment. He had the direct gaze of a man who had hired enough people to know the difference between the performance of competence and the thing itself. Monday, Dale said. 7 a.m. Bring your certifications. You'll have copies from the state board. By Friday, Ethan said. Dale said. He shook Ethan's hand with a grip that was the handshake of equals and not of charity. Ethan walked out of that shop and stood in the parking lot for a moment. His son was thin and pale but real. His hands were steady, and his chest felt like something that had been compressed for a very long time was slowly, carefully returning to its full shape. He called Cole. Cole answered immediately. Well, Monday, Ethan said. Cole was quiet for exactly 1 second. Good, just the one word. But the weight inside it was everything. The event that nobody had planned happened on day 38. Cole called Ethan at 7 in the morning and said, get dressed. Healing is happening and you need to be there. They drove to the Arizona Pathway Forward Resource Center on the north side. Ethan did not know what he was walking into. Cole had said nothing in the truck on the way over except that Miriam had called and that it was important and that Ethan needed to see it himself. Ethan walked into was a room full of people, not the community center, not a formal hearing, just the resource center's main room, which was not designed for the number of people currently inside it. Folding chairs set up in rows that hadn't been there before. The chair was filled. People stood along the walls. Recognized faces: Marcus, Sandra, Ray, everything. Gene and Pauline, Bobby and his veterans, with his legal pad, in plain clothes again. Most of the faces he didn't know. These were the 41 ones who had said yes. And they had brought people with them. Family members, friends, people from their new lives who had heard the story and come to stand in the same room where it was being acknowledged. Surrounding the building outside, engines idling low and then going quiet in waves were the Hells Angels. Not 483 this time, more. It had spread the way. Word spreads in a community that communicates through face-to-face contact and trusted networks. Chapter by chapter, person by person. Across a state that was larger than it looked on a map. Cross stood at the front of the room. She was composed in the way Ethan had come to understand was her natural register for real, present, and not pretending to feel less than she felt. She said, I want to tell every person in this room something that should have been said months or years ago. Been to you in my system was not your fault. You came to us with real skills, real history, stones still need. A willingness to work. You deserve what you came looking for. You received something else instead. And the responsibility for that is mine to carry even though the action was someone else's. I'm sorry. And I am asking you to give me the chance to be what we were supposed to be. Quiet. Then Marcus Teller, who had driven 2 hours from Tucson a month ago with the rigid posture of a soldier carrying something too heavy, stood up. He said, I start my new job next week. Someone in the room said, yeah, just that. But the way it landed in the silence was like a match catching. Okafor said, I'm back on the tools. Ray Diaz said, I got a call yesterday about the project management position. Opened it. Gene Hutchins didn't say anything. He just looked at Pauline, and Pauline looked back at him. And whatever passed between them and that look was private and complete, and told the full story of 8 months and the other side of them. And then Ethan, who had not planned to speak, had been standing near the back with the instinct to let other voices fill the room, because this room was not about himself, walking to the front. He stood where Miriam had stood. He looked at the 41 faces and the faces behind them and all the way back to the door. He said, a few months ago, I was sleeping on a mat in a shelter, trying to understand why everything I tried was failing. I thought I was broken. I thought something was wrong with me specifically that I couldn't name and couldn't fix. Feeling that specific feeling of being broken in a way you can't diagnose is the thing Reed and Pruitt counted on. The engine of the whole operation. Keep people separate. Keep them confused. Keep them convinced the problem is personal and they'll never look up long enough to see what's actually happening. Ramon, he stopped for a moment. I looked up because of a wallet, he said. Completely accidental thing. I happened to be in the right parking lot and I happened to make one decision. And that decision connected me to one person who treated me like a person. That's all it was. That's all it took. One connection that I almost didn't make. He looked at the room. So I want to say something to everyone in here who went through what we went through, and to everyone who might be watching or listening or reading this story later. The wall you were hitting was not you. Those doors were not about your worth. The silence from employers and the failed applications and the withdrawn offers, none of that was a verdict on who you are. It's a crime committed against you. And the fact that you kept trying anyway, that you kept getting up and filing and calling and showing up, even when you didn't know why nothing was working, that is not a small thing. It's everything. Nobody moved. Ethan said, honesty is not a strategy. It's not something you do because it's going to pay off. Turn that wallet because my father's voice was in my ear and I couldn't do otherwise. Do it expecting anything. I didn't do it as an investment because it was the only thing that made sense to me in that moment. He paused. But I want to be clear about something. The honesty didn't protect me. The honesty made me a target. The honesty put me in a parking lot and put me in a room full of bikers and put me on someone's radar and made my life harder for a while before it made it better. He let that sit for a moment. Do it again. Every time. Because what I learned is that the people who are threatened by honesty are the people who have built everything they have on a foundation that honesty destroys. One, that means honesty isn't weak. Honesty is the thing they are most afraid of. Ted Cole, who was standing at the side of the room with his arms crossed and his face completely still, and eyes on Ethan with the particular quality of attention that Ethan had come to understand was Cole's version. Something most people showed much more outwardly. When Cole gave him the brief, precise nod, Ethan looked back at the room. He said, all of you, for showing up, telling the truth when it was hard, for driving 2 hours and filling out more forms and sitting in more rooms and trusting that it was worth it one more time. He looked at Marcus, at Sandra, at Jean and Pauline, and Bobby and his veterans, Frank with his legal pad, and Taurus in plain clothes, and Miriam with her composed and real expression. It was worth it. You were worth it. You always were. He stepped back and came apart, slowly and warmly, rooms do, when the thing they gathered for has been said. And now, there is the human work of continuing conversations started. Remember, phone numbers exchanged, hands shaken, woman crying quietly near the door while her mother held her, Marcus and another veteran, standing together with the particular silent communication of people who don't need to explain their shared experience. Cole came to stand beside Ethan. For a while, neither of them said anything. Cole said, you know what you did in that parking lot? He turned to Wallet. Ethan said, no, Cole said. You told the truth about who you were, in action. You were alone and broke and hungry and invisible, and you made a decision that cost you nothing and gained you nothing in the moment, and you made it anyway because it was the right thing. He paused. That's not a small thing, Walker. Most people with full bank accounts and warm houses and all their documents in order can't manage that. He did it with $4.37 and an empty stomach and said nothing. The wallet was never the point, Cole said. The wallet was just the moment. The truth about you became visible. Sighed. Engine started in sequence as people began to leave. Was low and steady and receding. And in it was the sound of 483 people who had shown up for someone they didn't know because a man they trusted had asked them to, gone home with the knowledge that it had mattered. On his first day of work, Ethan Walker arrived at Dale's shop at 6:47 in the morning, wearing clean clothes that fit him. He had his certification copies in a folder. He had slept in the spare room at Cole's house for the last time the night before because Cole had connected him with a housing assistance program that Miriam's organization ran. and that was now operating the way it was supposed to, without anyone feeding the client list to a predator. He had his own place starting Saturday. Dale showed him the shop, introduced him to the two other mechanics, and showed him the current job tickets, and said, "Everyone, you'll start on the diagnostics backlog. We've got 4 trucks that 3 other people couldn't figure out. I want to know what you think." Ethan looked at the trucks. He looked at his hands. He picked up the first diagnostic tool and got to work. By noon, he had identified the problem on 2 of the 4 trucks. Dale came by at lunch, looked at the notes Ethan had written, and said nothing. For a moment, he said, "3 other mechanics. The symptoms were pointing the wrong direction," Ethan said. "It's when you're looking for the most obvious answer." This whole problem was upstream. Dale looked at him. Dale said, "It usually is." He walked away. Ethan went back to work. Bobby called to tell him that the Attorney General's office had confirmed 47 additional victims from Pruitt's database copy export records, bringing the total documented count to 96 people across 4 years. The civil suit on behalf of the victims was being organized by a law firm that had agreed to take it on a contingent basis after Frank provided them the full file. He remained in custody. His attorney's motions to reduce bond having been denied twice on the grounds that he represented a flight risk given the scope of the charges. Texted at 4:30. First day went well. You actually know what they're doing here. Sandra sent a photograph of herself on a job site. No caption. The photograph said everything it needed to. Gene Hutchins called at 5 and talked for 12 minutes about the delivery company and Carla, the owner, and how she had shaken his hand at the end of day 1 and said, "You're exactly what I thought you were." Gene's voice cracked once in the middle of the call, and he covered it with a cough and kept talking. And Ethan let him talk as long as he needed because talking was Gene's way of processing that something real had happened. Drove back to Cole's house that evening for the last time. Dinner at the table. With Cole and Diane and Marcus and Lily, the kids whose photograph had been in the wallet, real children and not photographs, and who argued about something at the dinner table with the easy noise of a household where arguments were minor and temporary. Dinner, Cole walked him to his truck. They stood in the driveway for a moment. Said, "You doing okay?" "Yes," Ethan said, not the polite version. Ethan thought about it for the time it deserved. "Scared," he said, "not of Reed, not of anything specific, just the ordinary scared. Of being responsible for things again. Of having a life that can be damaged again. Of caring about outcomes again." Cole nodded. "That's the right kind of scared," Cole said. "That's what it feels like to be back inside your own life." Ethan looked at him. "Thank you," Ethan said. "You already thanked me," Cole said. Ethan said, "I'm thanking you again." Cole extended his hand. Shook it. The grip was firm and brief and equal. "Monday," Cole said. Monday, Ethan confirmed. He got in his truck and drove out of the neighborhood and into the city, which was lit up in the way. Cities lit up in the evening, millions of small lights in a grid that went on longer than it seemed like it should. Through it with his hands steady on the wheel and his eyes on the road ahead. He thought about a parking lot, a cold morning, a wallet beside a tire. He thought about $4.37 and an empty stomach and his father's voice. He thought about 96 people who had their names on a documented record, now who had been told the truth, who knew that the wall they had been hitting at a builder, and that builder had been held to account. Not all of them had gotten their old lives back. Some of those lives were gone, but they had gotten something that in many ways mattered more than knowledge that they were not the problem, delivered clearly and officially, and with the weight of 100 people standing behind it. He thought about Marcus's text, Sandra's photograph, Gene's voice cracking once and recovering. He thought about Cole's hand and the equal grip of it. He thought about honesty, not as a strategy, not as an investment, just as a thing you did. Because your father's voice was in your ear and the wallet was in your hand. And the choice was simple even when everything else was not. A lost wallet had brought them together. But what kept them together, what built the trust, and the fight, and the room full of people, and the 483 engines going quiet simultaneously? in a parking lot was something that had nothing to do with the wallet and everything to do with the man who had carried it back. Walker had been invisible to the world for 2 years. He was never invisible to himself. And in the end, it's the thing that saved him. Not luck, not charity, not a dramatic rescue, but the simple, unbreakable decision to remain exactly who he was, when who he was had nothing left but its own integrity. The kind of honesty doesn't just survive, it wins.